As we cycle through our Jewish year and dip into our weekly Torah reading, we find ourselves always descending into slavery or moving towards liberation. We experience this kind of psycho-spiritual dance as a people, on a group level, as well as on an individual level. Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav said that the exodus from Egypt occurs in every human being, in every era, in every year, in every day. In this week's Parsha, we are on the precipice, awaiting redemption, but things are about to get darker before we move into the light of freedom. Our Parsha begins with God taking the relationship with the Jewish people to a new level, something unprecedented. In the opening verses of our Parsha, God reveals God's self in a deeper way, or at least in a novel way. God speaks to Moses and says to Moshe, I am, we translate this word as Adonai, but of course it is Yud-He Vav-He, the mysterious, unpronounceable name of God. Ve'era el Avraham, el Yitzhak, ve'el Yaakov, ve'el Shaddai, ushmi Hashem, Adonai, Yud-He Vav-He, lo nodati lachem. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by my name. Again, this name, Yud-He Vav-He, Adonai, Hashem. This phrase appears 4 times in this little section, corresponding, interestingly enough, to the 4 letters. It's as if God is saying, I am the same God that your ancestors knew, but you are about to know me in a different way than they did. Well, that's curious because actually this name appears 165 times in Genesis. So what's going on? What is God really revealing here? What is the nature of this new self-revelation of God? Commentators have varied ways of understanding these mysterious psukim, these mysterious verses. Midrash says that God is revealing God's compassionate side. As Yud-He Vav-He, God responds to the cries of the people Israel. Yehuda Halevi and Nachmanides believe that this revelation is about the supernatural events that are about to occur in the verses that follow that we just read. Rashi says, well, at this part of the story, we are numerous and cohesive enough to be a people and not just a family. And also, I want to suggest that Yud-He Vav-He is the part of God that makes for liberation. This portion begins with God's reintroduction or revelation and progresses to the tale of the struggle for freedom, a drawn-out negotiation for the release of the Israelites. There are moments when the Torah portion is just eerily similar to life as it unfolds in real time. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam matir asurim. As we've said numerous times this morning, blessed are you, God, who frees the captives. Well, how is freedom the key to knowing God in a deeper way, or a different way? What is the relationship between God and freedom? What are the necessary conditions for freedom? Let's start with the last question. There are 2 conditions to liberation: power and will. If we lack sufficient power, or we are overpowered by people or situations that enslave us, we cannot escape captivity. However, if we have power, but not the will to be free, we will remain slaves. No one can free someone against their will. This is part of the reason that, as Rabbi Shai Held reminds us, freedom is a spiritual project. It must be nurtured and attended to. It cannot be taken for granted. Yet, freedom is not only a spiritual project. Tragically, all too often, liberation is a tangible project. The release of Emily Damari, Romy Gonin, Jeroen Steinbrecher, and just recently, Liri Albag, Karina Ariev, Daniela Gilboa, and Naima Levy, fills our hearts to the brim with mixed emotions. Joy, of course, but sorrow for all that has been lost and anxiety for what is yet to come. Seeing these young women reunited with their families, who kept hope alive for over 470 anguishing days, inspires us to hold out hope for the release, please God, of Keith Siegel and the rest of the hostages, all the hostages. After an unimaginable struggle, these 7 women's autonomy and their power over their own bodies and their lives has been restored. The story of the triumph of human will over despair is encapsulated in the smile of former hostage Emily Damari as she holds aloft her 2-fingered wounded hand. Viktor Frankl said, "Everything can be taken from a person but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in a set of circumstances, to choose one's way." Through our origin story, which begins, of course, not in triumph, but in enslavement, we learn the centrality of freedom to Judaism. The Torah reminds us not to take our freedom for granted, but to remember that we were once slaves and to use the power of this memory to ensure that we care for the vulnerable among us. The Torah does not end when the Israelites escape from Egypt. Rather, the Israelites continued to wander for 40 years, bitterly complaining and wishing they could go back to being slaves in Egypt, as they realized that freedom conveys the burden of responsibility. Thus, we learn from the Torah that it is not only other people who enslave us, we also become enslaved to our own ideas and fantasies. The exodus from Egypt occurs in every human being, in every era, in every year, and in every day. Freedom is not achieved and then sustained indefinitely. Rather, we must constantly work to free ourselves from the return to Egypt. Freedom comes from being able to grow and change, not from remaining static. In Exodus chapter 3, which we read last week, Moshe encounters God at the burning bush, and God commands Moshe to lead the people out of Egypt. Moses asks God, "When the people ask who sent me, what shall I tell them?" God answers, "Ehyeh asher ehyeh, I will be what I will be." Rabbi Arthur Green teaches that this answer reveals the deepest, most hidden name of God. The truth that God is being itself. We might say that this view positions God as the context in which the world is unfolding. Rabbi Michael Strassfeld commented on this verse, saying that the God of Exodus tells Moses not to think that there's one fixed notion that describes God. The God of Exodus is the God of freedom, which by definition requires an understanding of God as ever-changing. Thus, God says, don't think that someone whose parents were slaves will inevitably be a slave herself. God says, I will be what I will be, and so can you. Freedom from a fixed identity does not mean that we don't have a steady, core sense of self. Rather, it implies that as we continue to evolve, we become more of ourselves. As we grow, we expand the parameters of ourself to include new dimensions. God's ability to change and be flexible means that we, B'Tselem Elohim, can be ever-changing and flexible while remaining true to the core of who we are. Perhaps in the opening of our Parsha, God is saying, you will see me and know me through the process of liberation that you are about to experience. Yud-He Vav-He is the part of God that makes for liberation. But we know that first, things are going to get worse before they get better. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs reminds us, when we're reading this Parsha, to remember that hope is born at the very edge of the abyss of despair. I want to close with a poem by David White, who was not, as far as I know, he's not Jewish, but I think he writes about the Exodus story in this poem, and maybe a little bit about our story. It's called The Journey. Above the mountains, the geese turn into the light again, painting the black silhouettes on an open sky. Sometimes everything has to be inscribed across the heavens so that you can find the one line already written inside you. Sometimes it takes a great sky to find that first bright and indescribable wedge of freedom in your own heart. Sometimes, with the bones of the black sticks left when the fire has gone out, someone has written something new in the ashes of your life. You are not leaving. Even as the light fades quickly now, you are arriving. Hope is born at the very edge of the abyss of despair. Let us keep hope alive and stick together as we move through these complex days. Let us continue to find joy in the freedoms that we have, and may God grant us the power and the will to move constantly on towards liberation. Shabbat Shalom.